So I'm really happy you're all here. It's Sunday morning, AHA, 9 o'clock. So I walked by some of the sessions. They look pretty, I'm glad we have an audience. This is going to be a roundtable, so we're hoping that this is more of a conversation than us talking at you. Historical thinking in the history survey, K-16 challenges and perspectives. The origins of this panel comes back to the AHA 2 years ago. I was in a tuning session, and people were talking about the importance of historical thinking and historical skills and how it's great that we incorporate that in our upper division history courses. And then these were mostly college faculty, and they were basically saying, you know, at the end of the day, it's too bad that only most college students, only 5% of college students will actually take a history class beyond the survey level. In other words, most college students, if they take any history at all, it's going to be a survey course. And isn't it so sad that they'll never get introduced to the sort of skills and disciplinary perspectives of history because we have so much stuff to cover? And I was thinking, you know, wait a minute. You know, these things are not, this is not dichotomous, right? You can talk about historical thinking and teach content at the same time. And so that's what kind of drove me to put this panel together. So the purpose of the panel is to sort of look at, you know, how do we embed historical thinking into our teaching of a survey course in US world or Western civilization or AP European history. And then I asked participants to come from 4 different educational settings. So we have Gail Hamilton, who's a middle school teacher in Long Beach Unified School District. And Gail did her MA in World History at California State University, Long Beach. Gail also teaches in our credential program and teaches either the History Methods course or the History for Social Science Teachers course. And you're also on an AHA committee, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And next to her, representing high school, is Justin McNamara, and he teaches at Achievement First High School, or Brooklyn High School in New York. And Justin did his bachelor's degree at Southern Mississippi, his grad work at Texas Tech, and he's in Brooklyn. So he's our most cosmopolitan member of the panel. And next to Justin is Rebecca Hayes, who's representing the community college. And Rebecca teaches at Northern Virginia Community College. Oh, I should have shown you the slide, actually. And Rebecca just spent a year at the American School in Dubai, so welcome back. And she's also the head of the Honors College and did her PhD at FSU, at Florida State University, and heads the Honors College at Northern Virginia Community College. And last but not least, Pete Burkholder from Fairleigh Dickinson University, who's a professor of history. And Pete was trained as a medievalist, but does a lot of work in history pedagogy and also work in history and film. And his article in 2015 won the Gilbert Prize for the best article in history education, and I forgot the title. It was catchy though.
Yeah.
Pete also forgot the title.
Yeah, I can't.
A content means to a critical thinking end,
there we
right?
go.
And it's actually a perfect segue to actually what we're going to be talking about today. So I've asked the panelists to each speak for, say, 8 to 10 minutes to kind of prompt a conversation with you all. And I think we've got all the different constituencies represented in the audience as well. And I thought I would situate the conversation a little bit by thinking about where the survey course comes from and traditionally how the survey course has been represented. The history survey course, since the late 19th century in the United States, we've been teaching survey courses in history, a survey of US history, a survey of Western civilization, and more recently, a survey of world history. And generally, what drove this in terms of history instruction in the schools was to basically create a survey of American history, to create a sort of common story, a sort of heritage model, if you like, right? And the model was very much a coverage model, right, to make sure that kids came out of the schools with a sort of common story of American history. And for most of since the late 19th century, generally that was a story which was sort of a progress narrative. At the universities, it's kind of part of sort of the American exceptionalism of American education, where we have the 4-year degree. In the 19th century, you had the liberal arts college tradition. Then when we had disciplinarity and research universities, the notion was that we don't want to lose that aspect of a liberal arts education, so we basically added a year on to the degree. Most countries have a 3-year bachelor's degree. We have a 4th, right? And the history survey course became a really important part of what we now would call general education, right? Which was part of that sort of additional year of college education. For many of us, at least in the public sector, at a state university like California State University Long Beach, where I'm at, I'm very anxious with timelessness to degree initiatives where I think they're trying to push that first year of college back into high school, but that's another conversation. Generally, over the long 20th century, and when people have talked about the survey course, the general representations of the survey course have been about these sort of dichotomous tensions, right? Do you teach content or you teach skill, right? Periodically, historically, there's been sort of periods where people were focused on, well, we should be teaching skills, not content, or the focus should be on skill, not coverage, if you like. In the survey course in the late 19th century, there was a kind of a movement towards sort of teaching with primary sources. There was another such movement in the 1960s with the new social studies movement, things like that. But at the end of the day, generally, the survey course has been represented through what I would call the coverage model. But you have these sort of tensions, right? Content versus skill. Is the purpose of the course to teach, is to cover the content, or is it to develop kids' historical thinking skills? Or is it a course that focuses on the sort of breadth of the historical experience, or does it provide the opportunity for students to go into depth? These have been the sort of tensions, and I think that'll come out of the panel. I would make the case that currently, though, we've had this sort of, these tensions have existed since the late 19th century. Generally, I would argue that coverage has won out over historical thinking or depth, or however you want to explain it, right? But I think since in the late 20th century, I think there's a sort of sustainability for a sort of focus on two things. One, the significance of introducing disciplinary thinking in a survey course, right? And the second is addressing the notion that maybe this idea about teaching skill or teaching content is in fact not dichotomous. And I think these are the types of things that have sort of sustained a focus on historical thinking, sustained a focus, if you like, on perhaps providing the opportunity to teach in depth within the survey course. The school's history project in the UK, which really got the movement going in terms of historical thinking, is now very much a transatlantic movement. The fact that with the baby boom in colleges of education, economy of scale, there became much greater specialization in colleges of education, where faculty in colleges of education and teacher education in particular became specialists, if you like, in history education as opposed to generalists, and that I think promoted a kind of historical thinking movement. I think it's timely in the world that we live in today, particularly today, that there's a sort of focus in a history survey course that students should also be thinking critically and analytically about stuff in the information age. And then one thing I think that was always sort of a burden that sort of was a barrier, if you like, to teaching historical thinking in the survey course was the issue of assessment, right? It's much easier to assess what Peter Lee calls a kind of sedimentary knowledge of content. If we teach historical thinking skills, how do we in fact assess it? And I think recently we've come up with some really clever ways, particularly in the AP program, of assessing historical thinking. So here's some general questions I think that we should be thinking about in the panel today. What are the implications of raising the visibility of the procedural knowledge of history? By that I mean the disciplinary knowledge of history relative to the knowledge of its content. What are the challenges of this approach? Are teaching historical thinking and historical content actually dichotomous? The answer is no. How does embedding historical thinking into a survey course alter the conceptualization and learning of content? I think that's an important thing that we should consider. And what are the transferable skills and knowledge that students gain when the history survey course is taught through the lens of historical thinking? And what is lost? Things for us to ponder. So I'm going to ask Gail to make her comments first.
Good morning. I'm so glad there's a middle school teacher here. You're the first middle school teacher I've met at one of these, or maybe the second. But anyways, I feel like we're kind of a rare breed. My presentation, I'm going to focus on two things, very briefly, about how the explicit teaching of historical thinking skills complements Common Core. So in middle school and high school classrooms, when I first started teaching, this is my second career, so I've been teaching for 13 years, the idea of teaching skills and all the content didn't seem like a problem. I thought I could do it all. But with Common Core and the emphasis on very close reading of text, I began to see that there is a a challenge because you can't teach everything deeply. And so I decided that the way that I would do that is focusing on skills. And I really like focusing on skills. I had a quote, I have to, really don't know why I have to read it, but one of the things that we know a lot about is how students learn. And we know how they learn because of work from cognitive scientists, and we know how they learn history because of people like Sam Weinberg, Peter Seixas, Bob Bain. And so I think about those when I try to plan my lessons. And so definitely historical thinking complements Common Core. The California State Department of Education, it identifies, and I've cherry-picked a few of these, but you can see these are all the things we want history students to be able to do. Right? We want them to have strong content knowledge. We want them to comprehend and critique, right? We don't want them, we're not just filling a vessel. We want them to value evidence. One of the things that I am impressed with since I've made the switch is my students, when I read papers, it's no longer a struggle to have them say according to or in this document, right? They're not just giving me answers without attributing where they got the information. And in history, at least in my classes, I feel like it's important that they understand multiple perspectives. So these all go really well with teaching historical thinking skills. So what I start with is what is best for students. And we know we want them to be actively involved. We want to make history relevant, and I think we need to turn history into an investigation. And these are pictures of my students. They all sign releases, so I can use their pictures in this. The thing that I am going to talk about is how I use historical thinking skills. So I'm going to identify a couple of the skills that I use and explain how I teach them. So the first one that I start off the year with is teaching significance. One of the things I want students to know, because students come in with this preconceived idea, something is important if it's in the textbook or it's going to be on the test. And so I want to turn that around so that they actually have a say in what they think is important. And we're building their skills for argumentation. So I started off with a beginning where they come in, it's a homework assignment, we call it the virtual time capsule. They come up with a list of 10 events that are important from their lifetime. And I try to encourage them to make them events that happened in the world, but some students, to be honest, they really don't think they can do that. And so they come up with events in their own life. You know, when I learned to ride a bicycle, etc. They come in the next day, and in groups, they share with each other what they came up with. They're in groups of 4, they share their list. Then I ask each group to come in and create a list of 5 that they think are the most important. And from that, I then ask them to rank them. So they can come by consensus. These are the 5 most important we all agree to. Now rank them and be ready to explain why number 1 is number 1 and number 5 is number 5. And then that's where I lead the discussion, and I ask the students to share out, you know, what do you have? Why is that there? And I help massage their answers. Because they might give an answer, and I'll try and say, like, so what you're saying, Anna, is that you mean that it affected a lot of people. And they'll go, yeah, that's what I mean. And so we'll write down the answers, and then I'll explain that I'm going to take all my classes together and come back tomorrow with a synthesis and see if they agree that these are the rules that we should use. And so I come back the next day with something like this. And to be honest, it changes slightly every year. A number of years ago, there was that huge oil spill in the Gulf, and so the students, they had included animals. They thought it should change the way people and animals live because that was on their mind. And it does, and you know, since then the animals have dropped off, but it depends on what they have. So each year it's slightly different, but it basically looks like this, and 5 is a good number for me to work with. And then we try to have that either posted in the room, or frequently I'll give them a handout that they keep as like a bookmark in their book. And so then we try to do lots of activities with the historical significance. So, and I steal from all the people that I see and read about. So you'll see this is from Peter Seixas. He has this idea of ranking significance in this diamond format. It works out great because I have 9 tables in my room, and so then there's 9. They each get an event, and then as a class, we come together to figure out like which is most important, most significant, using the criteria, and I try to get them to see that something that has several criteria that fits is going to be more significant, and that could change based on our perspectives, the closeness to the event. The way that this works is the first one is most, then the next 2 might be in 2 different categories, but they're equally significant. And then the third, I also like to have the students have debates. We've done NC2A style March Madness debates where we start off with like 16 events or people, and the students work in pairs. They debate and present their findings, debate with each other. We sometimes do, if you're familiar with AVID, there's a philosophical chairs, whole class debate. I take students outside where we're on timelines and in ranking number 1 to 10, and they stand up like, if they think their event is, a 9 on a scale of a 10-point scale, and then they explain why, and you can see the students are moving around. So I try to get students to really engage in it. We also make, I'm going to go backwards, this first. This is called the Gallery of Significant Historical Events. Gosh, oh my gosh. And the students will take an event, they get to choose, they put the date, the century that it's in, a brief description, and this is where it's really a challenge to work with them. It's brief, and then the explanation for why it's significant. And so they would, explain it, and then this is how we arranged it that year in terms of most to least significant. So the students seem to like the argumentative part, and I try to keep that going throughout the year. And so in the beginning, it might be like from the first 2 units. I start off in 7th grade world history with Rome and Islam, but as we go through the year, we keep adding on. All right. The second historical thinking skill, and I do these separately, I focus on one at a time and try not to forget them, is evidence and interpretation. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details. There's terrific ways to introduce it using sites for the SHEG website, lots of different ways to do that. One of the things I do like to do is UCI create a graphic organizer for students to use their content, like what they see, what they understand is in it, the context, the how it relates, the communication, how it relates to what they already know, and then conclusion. How does this help us answer the question? So it's a good way for students to go through each source and kind of scaffold the process of looking at it. And there's an excellent video on the teaching channel about how to teach students context, both little c and big C, what's happening in the world, what's happening at the time they created the event. So those are really great resources. I'm only going to talk about one more, cause and effect. It's the third one. And what I really love about this is the triangle developed by Peter Seixas. And what I love about this is it allows you, I use it as a formative assessment. So the students, you finish discussing an event, a unit, and so you're talking about the fall of Rome, or in this case it was the rise of a military society in Japan, and the boxes around the triangle are relevant conditions, the groups involved, and the individuals involved. And especially in the beginning of the year, it's a lot of whole class guided, but towards the end of the year, they can start to come up with those on their own in small groups. So once you've identified all those, then you have the student mark the X, and the X is on the edge. They can't mark it in the middle. They can't say they're all equal. They have to make a choice. They don't have to mark it in the middle like this student did. It could be all the way at the top. It could be, like 3/4 of the way, but it allows me, because I've got 37 students in class, to formatively assess how are they getting at what's their thinking, because students tend to privilege thinking individuals are important and they're the ones who make all these changes, instead of seeing some of the conditions and the groups involved as being, in some cases, more important. Okay, the other 2 skills that I focus on in the year are continuity and change and historical perspectives. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over each of those lessons, but I did want to just conclude with this does come at the expense of some coverage. I no longer feel, and when I teach my classes at Cal State Long Beach, I have to emphasize that they need to figure out what they think is important in the narrative that they tell about the story, and that's the part that we need to keep putting back in. I think we lost a bit of that with the emphasis on a lot of testing, is the story. And I think if we focus on the narrative and then choose selectively which of these events are going to tie in really well and make interesting questions for the students to investigate, I think the students are going to learn more. And I think that they're not going to know every single fact about history, but they never did. Right, our district, when we did testing every quarter, the proficient rate, initially it was 55%. So you could be proficient getting 55% right. That tells you that it's not working. So what I really liked is that this, I think, gives students something that at our school we've adopted it through all grade levels, and so they practice those skills again and again as they go on. And even though ours are maybe a little bit different from AP, they translate really well. They're doing the same basic kinds of things. So if they take AP in high school, they're going to be prepared for that. So there are some resources that I've used, and I have created a website, and I made a little cards with a URL to it where I put some of the resources there. And so afterwards, if you're interested, you can have that. But I'm going to turn it now over to Justin.
I'm disappointed, Gail, that you didn't wear that outfit that we saw in the last image.
Oh, yes. Oh, and I actually have a history lab outfit I wear, too.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I should have had that.
Thank you, Gail. So now,
Turn that off.
yeah, because now Justin, nobody else has slides, so I'm going to turn this off. Okay, go ahead. Justin McNamara.
Awesome. So I wanted to first start by just giving a little context behind the demographic and makeup of my school. So I teach in Brooklyn, New York, in the neighborhood of Crown Heights, and my students are, it's a Title I school. My students are predominantly Caribbean American, but also Latino and also some African American students. And I think this context really has shifted the way that I think about my classroom and the way that I think about this dichotomy of skills versus content coverage. So at the core of my classroom, I think about education as a means of empowerment, and history as a means of empowerment as well. So similar to what Tim mentioned at the beginning, that this early emphasis of coming out of education with a specific narrative about the construction of history, both at the U.S. history level, world history level, what the reality is that my students' history was never a part of that history that came out of that narrative. It was seen as their history was separate from, not together in constructing American history. So it really got me thinking about these shifts with the College Board shifts around historical thinking skills. How does that impact the way that I'm going to teach history in the classroom to overcome this emphasis on this one specific narrative? So I came away with kind of 3 goals of how I view my classroom now, given the shift of teaching both some content coverage, but also these larger historical thinking skills. So one of those is that our work is to reconstruct a narrative of the past, given the sources that we have. So that's a big emphasis of the class. The other piece is around not just knowing a narrative, but understanding how narratives are constructed and understanding how historical narratives that have been written, how the author made that argument or what was the motivation behind making that argument. And then lastly, I think one of the most applicable that I'm seeing with the new shifts is that we're more and more living in an information age. Some information, as we've seen with the recent election, whether you believe to be true or not, that is a lot of connects a lot about with who you are as an individual, who you are as a person. So I think these historical thinking skills really provide a basis for students to also analyze present information that they're receiving. And I think that's specifically important for the students that I teach because there's tons of false narratives and manipulated narratives about them as individuals that I think it's important for them to understand where these narratives come from. The biggest way that I've thought about doing both of these, and I agree with Gail that there is some content coverage that is going to happen, and I think being more okay with that as you teach the course really helps with how are you going to do that in a way where it's not just like the banking method of teaching where you're just going to tell kids what to think. So the way that I've done that is as a school and as a network, I also do the writing of the AP curriculum for the network. So we've moved to a solely inquiry-based lesson model. So whether that be using multiple documents through student investigation with a central historical question, or doing a close read of one document that's usually no more than 2 pages, primary source. And I think this moving to that, the big shift has been around making claims about history that are arguments about history that are claims-based rather than evidence-based. So I think early on, a lot of my students would present a history that was evidence-based. They want to talk about just these specific pieces of documents that we're looking at in class. So I think one of the larger shifts has been, well, that's not actually what historians do. They take multiple pieces of evidence and then they're making a larger claims about a topic. So one of the big shifts that we've done in our planning is to make sure that our discussions are claims-based. So the way that we've done that is in our each day there's like the first read of a document is comprehension based, and that's usually what we call the first loop read. The second loop is getting at the larger intentions of the author by analyzing some of the rhetoric that is being used. That also ties back to this information analysis that students need to do with present material. And then ultimately in the end, there's a whole group discussion that we're having that day that is claims-based, that then ties into a synthetic writing piece at the end. So each of those are chunked out being about 10 to 15 minutes with the synthetic writing piece. To get at the tension, so that's like the lesson model. Then to get at the tension of, say, of content coverage versus skill coverage, I remember that I was feeling really good about the lessons that I wrote last year in the curriculum, and so I thought we were writing some really solid lessons around inquiry-based instruction. But then when it came to assessment at the end, students still weren't knowing the material. There was still a large gap in just what they knew. And I was like, wow, well, that's crazy, because like we really went in depth in class on that. They really knew the information. And I think it gets at what Gail was talking about. There still wasn't this baseline understanding of a historical narrative that had been created. So the shift that we began to make is using the larger substantive concepts from the APISH course design. So now the way I kick off each unit is, say if I'm going to do progressivism, I'm starting baseline like with a central concept of what the progressives were and what they stood for. And then what I see the role of that next week, next 2 week, is that we really complicate that narrative. And we're asking students to then in the end ultimately reassess is this narrative that has been written about progressivism or whatever the topic you're focusing on, does it present a whole truth of that era, of that group? And so that's kind of the third piece. The final piece that I think has been really impactful, and it connects to this idea of education about empowerment, is that prior to, I would say, the shifts in the course design, I would say that a lot of my students, if you surveyed students in the building, they would say that they were not successful in a history class, and therefore they did not like taking history, or they did not like history as a subject. And I think a lot of that is because it's really difficult to memorize. And so I think the more and more that we've moved away from history as a memorization piece, and that history is about constructing a narrative of the past, giving the sources that you have, students have felt more and more successful. I think evidence of that is that in the last 2 years, we've doubled, our school does open enrollment with AP. You just sign up if you want to take it. We've doubled our number of students who are signing up to take AP US History, and we've also had double-digit growth in the students who've gotten qualifying scores from 1 year to the next. And I think that is largely a part of these other pieces, but then also students now feeling successful in a history course. And I think the other piece is that for my students also, they are now, because of what we can use in the classroom, they are now able to see a history, of American history specifically, that also includes their own personal histories. And I think that's another piece of why students are more and more feeling successful in taking this class. The kind of final piece that I'll talk about, and one mistake that I made that is in the last 2 years, is that I kind of thought that, wow, so if I give my students a history that is culturally responsive and they're invested in it, then they're going to do amazing on the AP exam. They're really going to blow the content out of the water. The reality was that just wasn't true. And that was because, not that culturally relevant history is not important, but I neglected to teach the skills that they needed to write and speak about that history. So it didn't, we might have been learning a more culturally responsive content, but I wasn't teaching the skills that was also a part of that empowerment that my students needed to have whenever they went off to college or whenever they sat down for the AP exam. So those have been kind of the biggest things that I've learned in kind of balancing this dichotomy.
Great, thanks, Justin. And now Rebecca is going to talk about these issues from the perspective of community college.
Thank you, guys. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay. So I would like to start just by, elephant in the room. Most people assume that community college students are not as good as university students, right? That they couldn't get in that they're just not up to snuff. I mean, it's a stigma, and a lot of my students struggle with that. And so I would like to challenge you with not looking at them in that light, right? And I taught at a private college, university, before I came to the community college, so I've seen both sides of it. And if you start looking at numbers, a lot of times we assume community college students are older, they're coming in to gain skills for the workplace, and yes, while that's true, honestly, about 60% or more are now traditional age students. And where I am in Northern Virginia, a vast majority, not quite a majority, but almost a majority of the students at my campus, for example, got admitted into four-year colleges, but they can't afford it, right? With the recent economic downturn. So we've seen many students who have the same abilities as our university students, but they just, for personal reasons, financial reasons, they can't get in. But regardless of that, whether they're at community college for any reason, or university, or high school, or middle school, they're all gonna ask you that question: why do I have to know this? Is this going to be on the test? Why is this important, right? That's sometimes the attitude that we get. And so I think our challenge as history instructors is to tell them why history is relevant to them. Like, why does it matter? That there's a bigger picture. And if they're just having to memorize content and battles and dates and those kinds of things, it seems very unimportant. But when we're looking at a bigger narrative, that draws them in a little bit more. And I tell them, like, look, as historians, we're just really nosy people. We want to know. I mean, think about it. We study a lot of like dead people and events. Why? Because we want to know, why did things happen? Why did people act the way they did? And honestly, why do we end up in the situation we are today? And so when you start phrasing it in that way, that gets them a little bit more engaged automatically from the class. And as you start to embed a lot of these historical thinking skills, I think it makes it a more engaging experience for the students and then for you. Because a lot of this is selfish. I don't want students that are out there like falling asleep, in their seats. And so the more engaged they are, the more fun we have as a class overall, but you're also giving them really valuable skills that they need no matter what level. Now, that said, at a community college, I maybe have different challenges than you guys do, right? And when you hear these numbers, I think the high school teachers are going to go, oh, that's nothing. And the university professors might be like, wow, that's a lot. So I have, at the community college, we have a 5-5 teaching load, which means 30 students about per class. So the high school teachers are like, that's nothing. But for most universities, you guys might have different numbers, right? Depending. But that said, you might also teach a survey course with 150. So a lot of this just depends on your numbers. But no matter how big your class is, you can still do this. You just might have to deal with some hurdles along the way. So typically, when we're thinking about this, you want your students to be able to critically think, analyze sources, interpret, understand. And so how do we do this? Well, we use writing assignments, right? Most of us will try to engage them with a research paper or an opinion paper using primary sources, using secondary sources. But that is very time-consuming to grade, depending on your class numbers. And I think that's why a lot of people shy away from it. I talk to many, professors who say, oh, yeah, I don't do papers because it's too hard to teach them how to write. I don't have time to teach them how to write. And, within the community college classroom, and this is probably true for many of you as well, reading levels differ within the classroom, right? You may have students who, English as a second language, that we have many of those in my college, or honestly, students, English is their first language, but they still don't know how to write or speak it, right? So it's almost like being in that schoolhouse back on, the plains, where you've got all these different levels in one classroom. And we don't have any prereqs to take survey courses, at least where I am. So I have students maybe who've never had that first comp class, and they come right into history, and you want them to wait, but no, here they are. Okay, so this is where it's like, it's negative. Why should we even do this? Let's just lecture at them and give them some tests and send them on their way. But no, it's possible to do. You can do this. We had a great tuning session yesterday where some of the professors, they were talking about how you could completely hand it over to the students and let the students drive it, and it's awesome, and you can do that. But I always caution like baby steps. I'll talk about a flipped classroom in a second. I think just taking that first step, for example, is to give them an in-class writing assignment based on a primary source, a very short one, right? See how long it takes them to read that source. See how well they answer the questions you frame around that source. I do this as a tool to kind of gauge where is everyone in their writing ability without making them feel very obvious that that's what I'm doing. When I teach an 8-week course, we actually do this kind of assignment every day in class because it's an extended class time. And then we discuss the source. So obviously, obviously, I'm losing time to talk about content, but that's where you just make that choice. What do I think is more valuable? And for me, them getting to see, this is a piece of historical evidence. How are we judging this evidence? That's more important than just shoving the content down their throat. It also, though, can help you figure out then, once you do like 2 or 3 of these, like what type of paper assignment do I want to create? I'm very reluctant to give them a true research paper assignment unless I'm teaching a 200 level or an honors class, because it's a little bit overwhelming for them. But what I like to do is I still like to give them a paper assignment based around primary sources that I've sort of hand chosen for them. Some of them better than others. And I give them a choice. I have different types of assignments. And so it might be something looking at treatment of women over time, in India, China, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe. It might be, the Mongols and the Vikings as the other, but then how they're reflecting on, the societies they encounter. So you can come up with lots of these, creative types of assignments. One of my favorites is a Crusades assignment where they're looking at Islamic and Christian sources, comparing the results of the First Crusade. And if you want any of these, by the way, I have business cards. I'm happy to share all the details with you. But that said, these assignments allow them to basically act as if they're historians, right? Now, we've set it up for them. I create the framework so that they're not having to just come up with brand new ideas on their own. But I find they tend to really like this because it makes them feel like they're doing what historians actually do. But I still have a little bit of control over it. But again, how do I have time to do this? Well, you have campus resources, so use them. You probably have a writing center. You have reference librarians who will actually show them how to interpret and analyze sources. And if you do give them, a paper assignment where they have to do their own research, those reference librarians will create a workshop for you to teach them how to, evaluate, is this a good source, right? Goodness knows they go online and they'll just pick any random website. So I found those workshops, which happen outside of your class time, right? So they don't take up your space. And also, you can require that to be part of the grade. So it makes them go out and use those resources. Now, I do offer my students, I look at rough drafts because I want to see them early. I want to see how they're doing. And I can offer this to every single student because I know they're not going to take me up on it, sadly. I'll only get a few, but then that lets me see which students, are really caring and how they're trying. And I try to tell students, too, this isn't just about, forcing them to write a paper. I'm really harsh with this, though. I put in the syllabus that if they do not do the paper assignment, whatever paper assignment I give them, they lose 10 points off their final class grade. Because the paper assignment itself is only worth 15% of the overall grade. So they could get that C or even a B maybe if they've done well in the exams. And they look at me with horror when I'm like, oh, no, 10 points. I don't care if you're sitting at a B, you'll drop to a C if you haven't completed the paper. Because to me, this is one of those important skills I can teach them is how to analyze, how to interpret, how to critically think. And I tell them, look, guys, and I give them explanations of some of my students are coming to get an automotive certificate, right? Or they're going straight into the business world. And others are transferring to the four-year university. So I tell them all different kinds of stories where you need these skills to succeed in the workforce, to succeed at the four-year university. And I try to convince them that there's value in this. But even if they don't believe me, the fact that they lose those 10 points, that tends to, see the value. I also tell them that, when historians in general, we have a lot of power, right? We shape narratives. And I ask them to start thinking about that. Like, first off, who's writing the history? How is it being written? Who is making the choice to leave out stories? Even when we construct the World History Survey, you can't cover everything. We make decisions about what to cover. Well, when you give your students some of that decision making, which I do, I allow them to pick and choose what they want to learn. They love that, but then they have to explain why. Why am I leaving out this society? And they have to justify that. But then we also look at how, for example, a long time history was written for the white upper class men. And who was, why were they choosing those stories? Well, who was writing the history? And especially in today's, as you mentioned, today's scenarios, right? How do they know if a news story, a blog, a website is valuable news? How do we know if it's credible? And I think that's a valuable lesson, more so today than ever, that they need to hear. And so if you want to do this with a flipped classroom, you can. I'll just caution you, try not to go overboard with it. That was a mistake I made because when I did that once, students said, but we want to hear you lecture. We like the stories you tell us. And I was like, oh, okay. So I just assumed okay, that's a good thing to hear. So I think it's about balance, right? I think you can use the flipped classroom to cover that content outside of class and bring it back in that you think is valuable. But I also think there's something to be said with keeping that narrative. narrative alive. And even if it's just us engaging in a conversation with our students, they will appreciate that more. So I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just wrap this up. You can use historical thinking in your survey courses to meet your course learning outcomes. You can use it to give them these valuable analysis and critical thinking skills that they're going to need, instead of just memorizing dates and content. But honestly, when you create a more engaged, class of students, it's going to benefit you. I like to think of it as me helping out the university professors, because I'm helping create these more engaged students. So yeah, I would just say you can do it, just don't be scared. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Pete Burgholder, our last panelist.
Good. So I'd say if you three send me your students, like 90%, 95% of my problems are going to go away. These are the very things that oftentimes I'm introducing these for the first time to students. Just to address the issue of content versus historical thinking, since Tim brought that up, I want to address it before I forget. To me, it's really sort of a false dichotomy. You can't teach historical thinking skills without content. It's impossible, and I can prove that to you. If we think of historical thinking skills as falling under the rubric of critical thinking skills. So on the count of three, I want everyone to think critically. Ready? 1, 2, 3. How'd that work out for you? 2, 1. Okay. So you do have to have some content. It's just a matter of how are they going to learn it? What's the delivery going to be? You can deliver, or you can have students master content in active learning situations too. It doesn't have to be just in the form of a lecture. There are ways you can do that. But anyway, one of the things that I do as well at my school is I run the faculty teaching development program. So I work with faculty from all the disciplines on these same sort of issues. I think that history, though, seems to be ahead of the other disciplines in thinking about these things and addressing them. And I'll have faculty come to me a lot and say, I don't really like this course, let's redesign it. And I run course design workshops. And the first question that I always ask them is, okay, beyond the content of your course, what do you want students to learn? And guess what I get? I get blank stares. Like I'm crazy that, the content is exactly what it's all about. And even though history seems to be a bit ahead of the curve, if I think about the scholarship by like Cypress and Volker or even Lendl Calder on coverage, their assessments are that most of the teaching that goes on, at least at the college level, is still a coverage model. And I think that they're probably right. It's really hard to assess that, but through serving on, say, faculty review committees, one of the things that I do, and this is for all disciplines, is I go right for faculty syllabi to see what they look like. And I can spot a coverage syllabus in 3 seconds, and that's almost exclusively what I see in all of the disciplines. That's just what we're doing. So in a way, you're kind of a weirdo if you're taking a different sort of approach, and some students can, react positively to that, some may not. But if I think about, the redesign of my introductory, my survey world history course, which I think I did in about 2007. I'd floundered around for years, and I knew I had a problem. I didn't know what it was. And I was finally influenced by the work of, Wiggins and McTeague, their Understanding by Design, which is, the backwards design process. And if you don't know what it is in the end that you want your students to learn, what's the point? You have to know what that is. And you have to start out the process. Don't think about content, but usually when we design our courses, that's what comes first. And I know on discussion boards about history, all the time there's these emails about, I'm going to teach this course, what are some good materials that I could use? And I'm thinking, you've already kind of blown it in a way. You can't think about that first, because then you're taking a content-based approach. So we think about what are the learning goals, and those should, again, transcend the field. So if I think of, okay, I want students to be able to think critically, and that's going to manifest itself in historical thinking skills. I want them to be better writers. Writing is not something which is exclusive to history. I want them to be able to work with their fellow students and to work with me. Again, that's something which transcends history. I also strive for information literacy. That's not exclusive to our field. And then we back it up a bit and we say, okay, now how do those things manifest themselves in history? And we address it that way. We also got to think about assessment from the very beginning. How are we going to assess that? Because usually we don't. We leave that until the very end, and then we're kind of in trouble. So when I redesigned my course, I thought, what is going to be the ultimate assessment that I want to see? And I thought, it's going to be a paper, no doubt about it. Now, that's not the only thing you could do, but it's going to be a paper. And then what I effectively had to do was what, say, David Pace does with the decoding process. We have so many skills and bits of knowledge that we bring to bear automatically. These are things that are in our deep memory. So we might be going through 5, 6 steps when we perform these things without even thinking about them. But of course, for students, that's not the way it is. We need to break this stuff down and say, okay, if students are writing this final paper, and I want them to be able to come up with an argument, I'm going to have to spend some time working with them on coming up with an argument and identifying what's not an argument. I'm going to have to work with them on writing skills. There's no doubt about it. Such things as quoting effectively. Students quote a lot, but very few quote effectively. Bringing evidence to bear effectively. Even things like introductory paragraph. I've seen so many times where students go off the rails in the first paragraph and they can't recover. So how am I going to address that? And I've come up with various diagnostics, specific steps for coming up with a good, solid opening paragraph, and I can give you some stats on that later if you want, because I'm always gathering data. I do a lot of SOTL work. And they're going to have to interpret primary sources. Okay, we're going to have to spend a lot of time on that. They're also going to have to grapple with historiography, and that's a new concept to them. So the way I figured it out is I'm going to break up the entire course in order to address that final assessment, and that's the way it works. Now, this also works out that it's called, this is a progressive learning environment where the course should get harder as the semester goes on. And it shouldn't get harder just because, they have to master more content. But they should be doing more ambitious things as the class goes on. So by the end of the course, they're doing something ideally that they probably couldn't do, or at least not do very well at the beginning of the semester. I can switch around content in order to do that, but really that's the way that the survey course is set up, and quite frankly, that's the way that all of my courses are set up. And I think that, again, a lot of students that take the survey, maybe that's the only history course they take, but you know what? You don't master primary source analysis in an introductory level course. You don't master historiography. I don't think anybody masters this stuff. You're always working on it. You're always getting better at it. So these are skills that, I work with students all the way through the major. You have to. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. Some of the problems, that I've run into is college freshmen usually show up, and this is not just my observation. I get more into cognitive psychology as time goes on. The works of Daniel Willingham, Stephen Chu have been very influential on me. But students generally come in grossly overestimating their abilities and their skills. I think there's a term for that. It's called being an 18-year-old. But I've gathered data on that too, where I'm involved in AHA tuning tuning program. What is it? Project. There we go. Something that begins with a P. And for our project, I teamed up with Sarah Schertz, who's a professor at Bergen Community College. And we gave, it was about 250 students, my institution, her institution, where we asked students to self-assess about their skills. And, their ability to interpret primary sources, their ability to come up with a thesis. You can imagine what we found. For instance, in their ability to arrive at a logical argument based on multiple sources about the past. At my school, 78% of the students expressed very strong confidence in their ability to do this. Only 6% registered any reservations at all about their ability to do it. Now, that's great, but then when I go to actually measure things like that, which I do, I asked a class at the end of the semester, they turned in their papers, how many of you think that you have a really clear and obvious thesis here? 86%. were very confident that they had it. But when I went through it and had other people look at it too, only 9% did. 43% were, quasi-passable. So, look, I mean, that's a bit of a problem. Part of that's on me because that's what I've been trying to do, and the success rate was fairly low. But I did come up with an intervention thereafter when I reran this using a new protocol. It bumped up 36% had a thesis. So, again, it's 36, you could say a failure. But, man, going from 9% to 36%, I saw that's pretty darn good. So I'm going to have to refine this. But I was very happy about that. And I can talk about it, if we like. So I'm about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Pete. So we're going to open this up to questions, your comments. I have a few questions as well. We'll start with you. Tell us who you are again.
I'm Nate Miller at Rifle High School out of Western Slope, Colorado.
Okay.
So my school right now is doing a big push for a reading writing discussion based on, I think it's Jeff Schwartz. But anyway, one of the buzz phrases going on is writing is thinking. And I guess the point is that historical thinking skills and historical writing skills are interconnected, I suppose, because when you're writing, you're thinking. And as you were talking, I was kind of going back and trying to figure out how did I learn how to be an effective historical writer. And I think the only thing I could come up with was that, I was blessed with a pretty good history department where I went to school, and it involved a lot of trial and error. So what I kept thinking over and over again, too, was that it becomes necessary then for instructors to provide consistent and valuable feedback on student writing. And so I don't know that it necessarily is I'm doing all kinds of different exercises in class, but when I was a student, but that when there were these high stakes papers or essays, and I wrote something bad, I had to look at the feedback and I had to make that choice. And I don't know how I did that because I was such a lazy student, but what I'm finding then translating as a teacher now is that my students don't take the time to read my feedback. And so I guess what I would ask is how do we get students to actually look at that feedback, read it, and attempt to make their adjustments based on that?
Don't give them a grade.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Seriously, because I found the same thing. So I would say, especially if you require them to do a rough draft, and again, this takes a lot of time, but I have them schedule time to come meet with me during my office hours, which makes them come outside of class to conference about it before I even give them a grade. But that's what I found to be successful.
Yeah, and I think similarly, I think we often, especially at the high school level, there's an assumption that students know how to do that. Like, how do I take a paper, read feedback from it, and then make changes? So I think there's also, he was also talking about, you got to teach it, right? You got to teach how do I take feedback from a teacher and then do something with it in my paper. I think there's a skill that has to be learned.
Yeah, I think that in my own experience as a student, it was going to the professor, the instructor, and having a conversation about it. But I think we run into, at least in my experience as a high school teacher, is I guess they're afraid to come and speak to you. And I would guess that that's probably more the case when you're teaching at the university level.
You're right, yeah.
Because you're this authority that you're, I guess, intimidating somehow. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are various things. One of the things that I do is I always have students, they have to turn in their previous papers with the current ones. Mm-hmm. And they have to show evidence that they reacted to the feedback. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, you can guess what happens. So as long as they're improving, that's fine. You can do portfolioing too, which I do at the end of the semester. And they have to reflect back. I've done more and more work on, reflective learning. Because, students aren't taught to do it. I wasn't taught to do it. I don't know when or why or if I even do, but it's a really important skill to try to instill it in students.
I think Gail has a comment, and then Ani. Yeah.
One of the things that we started doing at our school is the students, we have a rubric that the whole department agreed on, and so when they get their paper back, it has the rubric, and when we do the next paper, they have to say what their rubric score was and what area they're working on. And so I encourage them, they can't work on everything. You know, if they got a 2.5, they're not going to be able to improve all 6 areas of the rubric on one. I want them to focus on one area, and that's what I'm looking for when I grade the next paper. And so it forces them to reflect a little on what they did, what they're trying to do. And then I've tried to set up writers' workshops where the students who are getting those really low scores work with me, and then the other students who are getting like 3s and 4s can kind of work with each other to help each other. But when someone's getting a 1, it's really difficult for all the 1s to help each other. So writers' workshop and forcing them to give feedback, showing that they saw yours, like what Peter said.
Ani,
I teach high school as
speak
well.
really loud so it gets captured in the.
I teach high school as well and have for a long time and came from the old school of writing a lot of essays and comments, and they get chucked in the bottom of the backpack when you turn back. And I went to doing as well comments because I can't help myself, but little tiny rubrics, thesis, evidence, analysis, just to start with. And I had more kids come back to me and say, hey, I've never gotten a thesis point. Can we sit down and talk about this? All right, and that's probably after 25 years of teaching. But the other thing is we got a new principal in my school a couple of years ago, came out of the English department mode in a previous lifetime. And he sat down and talked to me as chair of the department, and he said, I want to talk to you. Your department doesn't do a lot of writing. And I'm like, I don't know who you've been talking to. We do more writing. We do as much writing as the English department. And I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And finally we got to the end of it, and he says, you don't let kids rewrite. Another jaw-dropping. You're right. I never had let them rewrite tests. And I thought, that's an incredibly fair point, adding to the grading load. But what I did was, with that tiny little rubric, with maybe just the 3 points of a thesis and evidence and an argument, they get to rewrite it. They have a certain time period. It's homework. And I will take the rewrite grade. Which I wrestled with mightily. And that, I can't do it for all tests because I need to sleep sometime, but maybe every 3rd test I give, I let them rewrite. And that has produced some interestingly good results. And sometimes if I'm worried I've got the kid who will spend 8 hours on the rewrite, I make him do it as a Google Doc and I limit him to 250 words. Or I make them do it in class if I've got a very hyper-competitive class, which sometimes I do. But to make them go back with a little thesis or with a little rubric and go back and do that has actually had some really good results.
I think Ollie has a question or comment. I just found it behind the podium.
Yes. Ali, I teach at Cal State Long Beach, world history, and
Do you mind speaking up? You might capture it with the microphone.
Ali Iman, Cal State Long Beach, and I teach world history, Central Asian history. As Tim and Gail know, we teach many high school teachers, we prepare them. And I was just curious about one thing that Gail pointed out. I love this idea of 10 events that they come up with from their lives. But how do we move them without making them, telling them what to think, to move away from Eurocentric views or America-centric views? Obviously, they live in America. Their lives are directly related to, the West. So, do you have any strategies, any of you, to sort of make us think? When I teach a Silk Road class, they come in and they say, never heard of any of these places or names, which I don't know if I should believe, because I imagine they teach some of those, concepts in high school. But how do we do that? How do we make them think more broadly?
One of the things that I've done, and the California state standards really helped me out with this, is, and situating the class as inquiry-based, is I have them, the question is, and for middle school students, we have to teach them what is Eurocentric. I mean, it's just their worldview. They don't know if it's Eurocentric. But we talk about that, and then I have them look at the standards and have them decide, are the California state standards Eurocentric? And let them discuss it.
And the answer is yes. Go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but for some of the students, they think, well, yeah, but those things are important. But explicitly letting them see what is, and, in the California State Standards, I point out, we have all of our units in 7th grade last 3 to 4 weeks. We have a 3 to 4 week unit on the Reformation, so one branch of one religion, and we spend the same amount of time talking about China from the Tang Dynasty to the Ming Dynasty. And so, I point those things out to them, because initially they say, oh yeah, we talk about China, we talk about Africa, but then I point out, look at what we do with Europe. I mean, basically we're talking about 2 or 3 guys in Europe during this very short time period, one religion that breaks away from another, and what we do the same time with all of China. We do 3 empires in Africa in that same time period. So then they start to see it. But I think the first step is getting them to see how the narrative is told, so that then you can start introducing, like, well, what should be in here? What should we be talking about?
Can I just interject? I've actually seen her 7th grade kids talking about Eurocentrism, which I think is super cool. I mean, we talked about historiography, and I think you can do historiography in middle school. You don't have to use the word, right? But if you get kids interacting with history as a representation and whose story is being told, right? I think that's, I think a lot of folks say, well, historiography is something for Pete's class, not everybody else's. And my argument would be that any survey course should be either historiography is essential to being integrated into that. Angela.
I have Angela Lee, Weston High School in Massachusetts. I was thinking about, I got to one of the tuning panels, and then I had a very interesting discussion with Lee last night about how we see assessment across these historical thinking skills. And having a panel like this is great to sort of see the span. Is there any research out there sort of taking examples of and showing, this is what analysis looks like in the middle school, this is what it should look like in the high school level, this is what it should look like in the collegiate level? Has there been any kind of evidence that sort of shows normative spans of what a student should be able to do at certain levels?
I'm not aware of any research on that.
Well, I mean, if you look at AP exams, they do have very specific rubrics for like what a piece of analysis looks like. No doubt about that. We can quibble about that. Otherwise, yeah, I'm kind of drawing a blank as to something specific.
Well, no, but I think that's an important point. I think one of the problems we have in history education, and I've been publishing and calling it it's a movement, right? But I think one thing the movement hasn't done is sort of addressed sequentially, right? What these sort of performance outcomes. What can we expect a 7th grade? What does historiography look like? Being able to think historiographically, competently. What does that look like for a 7th grader compared to a 10th grader compared to a 13th grader? Freshman in college and to somebody who's graduating with the degree. I think I don't think anybody's done that type of work, and I think that's a challenge.
It is, but one of the reasons that I adopted the Peter Seixas 6 standards, and I just used 5 of them, is that he has very detailed rubrics for what each one looks like. And I share those with the students, and they self-evaluate, and there are lots of areas where it shows what an emerging, what a proficient looks like. But it's not across a vertical alignment. It's just, this is what the skill is, and when you master it, this is what it looks like.
And I believe the C3 stuff does that as well, but the actual assessments that are aligned to it and what that actually looks like in terms of student performance, I don't think we have anything.
Yeah, I would say it is the major problem that I've seen with teaching the historical thing. It wasn't, for the A-push redesign, it wasn't until this year that I have okay, so this is what you can accept as evidence for this given DBQ. There was a rubric with tons of wonderful fancy language, but what does that mean in actual practicality when the student's writing it? It's been enlightening about we do looking at student work across the network, and the reality is we were giving a lot of points for stuff that wasn't going to get it based off of the AP performance standard. So I think it is developing and is promising, but it wasn't there until this year for A-Push.
Yeah, the new AP items, I think in particular, are really good, but I think it's kind of, we're at the cutting edge of this. Yeah. And announce who you are again?
I am Mike Long, and I teach world and Western civic surveys at Front Range.
Okay.
We'll call it some other things. And I guess what I'd like to hear maybe a little bit more about is I really do want to make the centerpiece of my classes the research paper. I guess I'm sort of old school, but that big artifact to be the centerpiece of the class. And I've, figured out ways to chunk it out. They're doing drafts, they do peer reviews in class along with the feedback they get from me and from the writing center. But I want to figure out better ways to teach the skills that I want them to show me when they're writing this research paper. And just wondering if there are any other ideas for how to workshop those skills in a way that is maybe embedded in the content, so you're not, oh, I'm just giving up this day, and I lose this content.
So how you scaffold this stuff.
Right. Yeah. How can you be teaching those skills and teach them how they can incorporate them into their papers while still being steeped in the content itself?
I can think of two ways for that one. One, I don't know if you've ever used any of the AP materials, but the DBQ, the document-based questions. So I've actually used that as a way to teach them how, so whatever, era we're on, whether we're, doing the Mongols or Vikings or whatever. So you pull those documents in, and again, giving it to them to read ahead of time is better, which is not how we do it actually with the AP exam, right? But I let them see it ahead of time, right? So they're ready. And then we come into class, and you can let them break into small groups and then write like a small, like mini sort of essay based on those documents and then discuss it. And then you're still kind of talking about the contents, because you have to do a good job with picking your documents, right? But like Ibn Battuta and others who are actually talking about like what's going on. And to kind of call it cheating, but to cheat, like I set it up ahead of time by doing an online lecture that they listen to before they come into class. So that's how I've gotten around it, because, and I don't know what software you have, and I am not a tech guru person at all, but if I can figure this out, I always say anyone can, but I just embed it right into the PowerPoint, like I record it in my PowerPoint with the little headset and put it on Blackboard, because that's about as fancy as I can manage. But that way they can listen to the background lecture, I'm just using the Mongols, of the Mongols or whatever. They've got the documents ahead of time. Then when we come into class, like it's an in-class exercise. It's nowhere near the size of a research paper, but at least gets them thinking along those lines. And a second way I've done it is, and have you ever shown them one of your papers? Like, I mean, and not to like intimidate them, but just to show them, hey, like this is actually how I've constructed a paper. I've done that before. I even gave them one of my undergrad papers to see how bad it was, which was a little humiliating for myself too, but it kind of helped. So I don't know.
Okay, so I have not shared my own writing with them, but I do, if I get particularly good papers, I will ask students for permission to share them.
That's good.
Classes.
Mom.
And I do, certainly we do analysis of primary source documents, but I think that's a great additional tactic to not only are they reading, the document and, answering some questions beforehand, but maybe in class doing a little bit of writing where they create.
And I forgot to mention the history. You could, since you give them the primary stuff ahead of time, then in class you can hand them a secondary source that brings in a little bit of the historiography, if you wish, to show them again how they're constructing it further from the primary source. Like find an author who's made this argument, whatever the topic is, so they can see how a scholar then maybe has used some of those sources. You might, after they've done their own, you might show them, well, this is what a scholar did with these same sources. So.
See, for me, it's like I've moved away. I don't teach. I have to be completely transparent. I don't actually teach the survey course anymore, but I teach 300 and 400 level world history courses, and I've moved away from the research paper. I find the research paper for me there are better ways for me. I think about what do I want my students to be able to know and be able to do. And I find that the research paper, there's a lot of noise in it. And I've moved increasingly towards smaller and smaller, and it's not because I'm lazy, to smaller and smaller types of assessments, short writing assignments that are very, very focused on a particular historical thinking skill. I do a lot of electronic beachboard responses, and my papers are very, very focused. And when I do a research paper, and I know this is wrong, but I do it backwards. I basically, for example, in a course I taught last semester, it's about the Atlantic world. I basically went on to 18th century short title catalog, and I found like 45 different printed, published travel narratives or travel logs from the 18th century. And I basically said, each one of you, your paper, your research paper needs to be built around the source. You choose which one. You have to then, we've talked about the skills of historiography. You need to build the historiographic build around the document. Then you need to build, we've talked about contextualization. You need to contextualize the document. In other words, I give them the source and then have them build the paper out from the historical thinking skills I've already introduced to them very deliberately across the course in these sort of scaffolded assignments. Because I just got sick and tired of go find a research topic. You see what I'm saying?
No,
And I felt like there is stuff I want to cover, and I also want to introduce these historical fields, and I found this to be much more pragmatic. And my colleagues think sometimes like, you're crazy, you do all these beachboard responses, right? These short, I had 35 students in this class, and almost weekly beachboard assignments are a page and a half. And what I tell my students is like, look, here's the purpose, I'm very transparent, we're working on this particular skill. The prompts are, we haven't talked about reading yet, but I want to prompt your reading with this prompt or whatever it might be. And then I tell them, I reserve the right to score them without checking for my grammar. I look at them online, I read them, and I literally just blah, 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 you didn't address this, dot, dot. And I'm very deliberate with them that what you present to me has to be formally written, but these are the conventions that I work in, and I have to do this 15 times. I reserve the right to respond to you without checking for my grammar and typos and all that. And I found this to be really effective. My discussions are really rich in class because I know my students have come to me already prompted by what we're reading. Anyway.
Let me add real quick on that for a very polished answer to your question. There's an article published by Elizabeth Belanger in The History Teacher about a year ago, where she addresses this very issue of the research paper in an introductory course. I don't remember if it's world history, but she walks right through it.
Yeah, that's a really good piece, actually. Yeah.
Belanger, she was here at AHA, I think. Belanger.
Yeah, and it was in the 2014, I think. Anyway, you'll find it online. Yeah.
Jay LeBlanc, Littleton Academy, middle school level. Let me preface this by saying I think everybody somewhere along the way basically said at one point or another with the survey course, you've got to make decisions as to what you're going to include, and that if you want to incorporate more historical thinking, something's got to go. So I guess a two-part question. One, how do you decide, or on what basis do you decide what's going to go, and sort of getting to what a couple of what the middle school and high school teachers both said, what accountability do you have or do you have to deal with in terms of what you give up? That if you don't teach everything on the AP exam, you're going to have a problem when the kids take the exam, or like in my case, you get to the end of the year, you take the state testing, if you haven't covered everything that's going to be on the state testing, the principal isn't going to care all that much as to the development of your historical thinking skills if the kids didn't score well on the test. So I guess my question is, what do you give up, and what's the accountability for what you give up?
What's the price?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent question.
Yeah, I get really, I should be better at data stuff, but I'm not the best at it. But I get really nitpicky. I mean, I pull out the course description. I figure out like what specifically, excuse me. So going by periods, because it's going to break down for you percentage on the exam, what's going to be tested, and I really make my decisions that way. So I think it's really important that like we're going to learn this skill, but we're going to learn it through this content, and I'm going to do it here. And then I think about like what is the cost benefit here? What am I going to lose out on? And I try to plan those through homework, through flip model, kids maybe watching videos online, and then we're assessing it in class with a quiz. And then I also think about what are the more complicated, larger, substantive concepts that we need to spend longer on in class. And those are the things that we're going to really dive deep on in class, because you can't do everything.
I'm curious, what do you give up?
Yeah, what do I give up? I give up things that are not interesting for me to teach. No. But then also like what I presented earlier, I want to do things that are also relevant to my students. So for instance, like abolition movement, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on William Lloyd Garrison, because the reality is they've probably heard of that guy before, but my students haven't heard of David Walker, right, as an abolitionist. And so I think those decisions are more important to make long term. Like there's decisions I make that like I think about, okay, there's a decision I need to make here. Is it about are they going to be hurt on the exam by not knowing this? So the exam's one part, but ultimately who they are as beings, is it important that they know this information? And so I weigh those constantly. So it's a balance. I don't have a rubric for deciding what it is. And to the point of state tests, the reality is that I haven't seen my students who are in AP who, because I teach two section AP, two non-AP, even though we're not covering content that's on the state regents exam, they still outperform the other class, even though we may not cover all the same topics that are on there. Yeah.
Yeah, and in my district, in California, we don't have a state test for history anymore. And the district eliminated a couple years ago our quarterly exam. And what we're responsible for is 4 DBQs. And there is a little bit of choice on the DBQs that we can do for the students. So that's partly how I frame it, but I have a lot of flexibility. Is I can leave out content and not have any penalty. What I pick is things that I think are interesting for my students, things that allow me to create more inquiry-based lessons, and what I leave out are the things that are kind of like random one-off. There's so many factoids in our standards, and so some of those things are not going to be part of the theme that I'm including in my narrative are the ones that get left off.
I'll just chime in really quick. I sometimes ask students what they come in knowing. And at least when I'm teaching world history, I get really frustrated by how sometimes world history can still be very Eurocentric. So that's what I tend to cut, is more of the Euro stuff. Especially, I find a lot of my students, they don't have any knowledge of Africa or the Latin American revolutions, for example, when we're talking about the 19th century. So I might skim, and I mean, I'm still going to talk about the American and the French revolutions, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to use that to kind of move us in more in depth for the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Revolution, just because I feel like they don't have that background knowledge. Now, we're in a little different position because we don't have the same, like the testing, obviously, so we can make, but I also horrify, my husband who teaches AP World, because I don't start until 3000. I'm bored by the early, Paleolithic. I know it's important, but I don't care. So I start, I'm like, y'all read that in the textbook, it's fine, but I start with the year 3000, but I can make those decisions because I don't have
And that's part of what I was wondering from your perspective was what do you see when those kids get there? Do you find that they actually got content from the earlier because obviously in the middle what you get is, you wish the elementary teachers sent you smarter, better prepared kids, and the high school teachers wish you were sending them smarter, better prepared kids.
It
and
snowballs.
when they get to college, they say, you got to go back to remedial classes because obviously you didn't learn anything.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I don't do is blame the people before me. That's too easy.
Yeah.
And frankly, look, when students get to me, if we look at Easter Island or something, if they ever, looked at that in classes, usually they have. They don't remember much. I don't care so much about that. The content stuff, if you think of Bloom's taxonomy, that's the lowest level. If I could wave a wand and change something about my students, I'd make them better writers. It wouldn't be that I just fill their heads with all sorts of information, because, you know, I'm not saying learning content is easy, but that's probably the easiest, you know, thing for them to do, or even to offload it. Now, I would say too that I'm not totally off the hook. About half of our majors are going into teaching, so they have to take the praxis exam, and that is totally content-based. So, what do I do about that? Well, I remember when I wrote an article on the survey, I went through the introductory course books on world history, and, you know, and here I was just thinking about origins to 1500. And they range about 20 to 25 chapters of about 20 to 30 pages apiece. You can't get through all that. I don't care what you do, and it'd be silly if you try. So what I've tried to do is, okay, you know, geographically I want to be responsible. I don't think it'd be a very good world history course if everything's centered on Africa, you know, or Europe or whatever. So I want to kind of hit the globe. I want to hit different chronological periods, and I can switch that up. And if I go real meta here, what am I ultimately trying to make my students? I'm trying to make them independent learners. You know, so that when they've got to take that praxis exam, then they can figure, okay, what do I got to do for this? And, you know, they can pick up study books and learn that, because I'm not going to cram their head with content anyway, and they're going to forget it all, even if I do.
I think one concrete example of, like, I think when you're teaching with a conceptual framework, so using the substantive concepts that are in the course description, right? Then you can make choices about, if you stay, so then I'm responsible to the conceptual framework, not responsible to content coverage. So I can choose certain content that fits into that framework that gives students the flexibility. I think ultimately with the goal, right? I would love for one of my students to go into a survey course in college and, you know, speak up and actually, professor, have you considered this perspective on, you know, I think that's ultimately like what we want students doing, because that means they're critically thinking, they're challenging what narrative's been out there, et cetera.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think, Justin appears to be the only one who's being held accountable, but by the AP. But even if you think, and I should have said, I'm the chief reader for AP World History, and I think we're kind of buzzing around this issue, but the whole issue of the textbook, like the new AP redesigns are not a curriculum, they're a framework. In fact, what Justin's held to in terms of account is actually quite minimal. The quote-unquote content that can be tested is relatively limited, in my view. As somebody who's on test development committee, it's very limiting. It's kind of hard to, there's a lot of stuff I would like to ask that we can't ask. But the problem is that the textbook has become the curriculum, right? And so teachers have this giant world history textbook in their classroom, and they think, I mean, to me, the textbook is the driver of the coverage model, right? Yep. At the university level, in middle school, right, there it is, right? I made my students buy it, right? And at the end of the day, the notion that we have to get through everything in that textbook, I think, creates all sorts of noise in terms of the integrating historical thinking. And personally, I've moved away when I have taught a survey. I use the abridged version of the textbook, and it's not required.
Nope.
And I'm like, there's other ways you can find the content, and I'm very big on what Justin's talking about, is teaching through the lens of what substantive concepts, right? Basically, my students understand what imperialism is, they understand what liberalism is, that there are these substantive concepts that they can kind of hang the content on. Because the thing we're not talking about is, at the end of the day, our students still need to know stuff, right? And they still need to remember stuff. And I think about the AP exam on the FRQs, these sort of content-driven questions around historical thinking skills. Students are not performing well on those, and they're not performing well on those because they don't know what's being asked. They know, oh, I need to address change, I need to address continuity. They know how to think historically. They fail because they can't remember, right, the evidence to put forward to make a claims thing. So I think here I am like promoting historical thinking, but at the end of the day, the purpose of the survey in some ways is to also give students a body of content knowledge that they can use. And how do we get to that? How do we get to that so they can remember stuff? Having them read the entire textbook and memorize it is not the solution. But I think some research tells us that kids that are engaged in sort of historical thinking actually remember stuff. In other words, you're actuating knowledge because you have to use that content to make a claim. You're more likely to remember it as opposed to in a sort of factoid multiple choice test.
Don't you think that goes back though into making them see like the bigger picture, like the themes that are uniting, for example, like they were talking about revolutions and how the revolutionary movement in the age of, like the Enlightenment and questioning and that, free radical thinking then builds us into, pushing forward into, I don't know, what the Industrial Revolution and nationalism. I don't know, I feel like if we come back to like, in a way, these bigger themes, and that's where you can choose. You don't have to make them memorize specific facts about the American Revolution or the French Revolution, but if they can sit down in front of that test and remember, oh yes, I remember what's linking all of these things together to get us here, I think that's where we sometimes see more success. But.
Yes.
I just want to offer just a little concrete endorsement, something Rebecca mentioned that I found very wonderful. My name is Pat Casey. I teach American and world history and U.S. history, U.S. and European and founded in Portland. A wonderful way to integrate doing process as well as content. All of those resources that are out there in Artpiece Library and Writing Center, I actually take students down to the library. They do a big thing. And another thing, the library people are working with me basically because they came up with a brilliant idea. I like to do research papers as well. They probably all face maybe doing into the new frontier or something like that. I haven't analyzed popular culture stuff. They already know it. So they're already engaged, at least in that part. Now, you're in a different world when you're analyzing popular culture, granted. But still, it's the same skill set. So if you can live with the fact that the movie JFK is not history, that's the point. That becomes the point. I love to have students analyze old movies and what does it say and yada, 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 and stuff like that. And it would be very difficult for me to do this without the resources out there, in my case. And it seems like librarians are all film buffs, so they love this. They just love this kind of stuff. So my point being, the resources that are out there allow us to do stuff that are, we can't do everything, so they are out there to help. And if you find stuff that the students are already engaged in, you've sort of crossed over one hurdle.
Yeah, for sure. Another question, comment? Okay, I'll pose one last one, and this is about thinking about your perspectives on mastery. I mean, I think one of the challenges in history education, one of the arguments was one argument against the factoid approach was kids in a math class, they have a sense of mastery. I can add, I can do this, I can do that, and I've achieved it. And the old factoid approach to history was kids hate history because at the end of the day, if they have to memorize facts and that's how they prove achievement, at the end of the day, they can never know all the facts. I thought I knew all the facts about the American Revolution. Now I need to know all about the American Revolutionary facts in South Carolina. Now I need to know the facts about the American Revolution about women. And so you get my point, right? And one of the arguments for historical thinking is that in fact actually gave students a better sort of sense of mastery. And I thought I heard that coming out of the conversations, right? That they're more engaged partly because they feel that they can be more successful at it, right? But I ask you, is that really happening, in fact? Are your students really engaged because this sort of approach, actually, they have a sense of mastery? Or do they feel, at the end of the day, frustrated by the fact that they can never master these types of skills?
I see both. I mean, you'll see students that do both. And here I think, too, of the work by Ken Bain, what the best college professors or teachers do.
Yeah.
And he's got that term, strategic learners. And, oftentimes you don't know. You can have a student do really good work, get an A, but was that student just performing? Right. Just jumping through the hoops? So it's really hard to know a lot of times, I think.
Yeah.
I think, I agree. It's not about, honestly, the grade. I think for me, it's when I have a student who started the class with absolutely no interest of being there, and some of them will tell you they either hate history, they don't think it's interesting, and they start having those conversations with you, so that by the end of the year, they say, wow, I feel like not only do I understand, why this is important, but for me, it's all about situating in the current world today. So when they can say, well, I really get now why we have all these issues in Syria, and I'm really starting to see those connections in the bigger picture. I mean, that's hard to assess and measure, but to me, that's how I define success, is when they're starting to see not just the value, but they can put the connections together. That doesn't mean they're getting A's in my class, but.
Yeah, I think it's something interesting. So there are also students who get very frustrated with when you are forcing them to create a narrative and create claims rather than just like, here's the right answer, right? A lot of students want to just tell you the right answer to get this affirmation. So I think part of the mastery has come from I think being very specific with kids about like, what is the skill we're attempting to master today. I've moved to a lot more discussions in class, not just about content, about, okay, today we're focusing on argumentation or making claims based responses. What did you learn about how to make claims from where you started today and where we are at the end of class? So having kids get meta about that will lead to more transferability, more mastery of those skills, because it applies to multiple settings, not just a history classroom.
I would agree. I think my students get more engaged, not because they necessarily see themselves as mastering a skill, but they have a point of view that they can express. But I do try to make it more game-like, that they can master the skill. I've ordered stickers from this company that are for each of the different historical thinking skills, and so in the different assignments, when they demonstrate one of the criteria, then they get those stickers. When they master all of them, they get a button. So it's kind of like a game, so that they are engaged that way. But I think my students, as Justin said, when they have to like just regurgitate a narrative that somebody else created, is not interesting to them, because many of my students don't feel like that reflects their heritage, who they are. And so being able to question, are the standards Eurocentric, that gives them a point in where they can argue it. We talk about what should be there instead.
Good. I was going to be contrary as a final point. I might as well be. I think one of the arguments, though, is that this focus on historical thinking, and I think a lot of us are saying we're going into depth. Historical thinking, it's not dichotomous, et cetera, et cetera. I do think there's something to be said, though, about narrative and kids and students having a sense of a story about the past, a sort of narrative about the past. And I think as we move away from coverage in the survey class and focus on historical thinking, the danger is that we end up sort of post-holing and doing a bunch of sort of in-depth studies without seeing the larger connections. And I wonder if having a sense of narrative, even, I don't want them to accept received narratives, but nonetheless, I'm increasingly thinking that I also want them to have a narrative about American history and a narrative about world history. It's complicated. I don't want them to have the received one, but I want them to have one anyways. And I want them to have one that I like, but that's another story. But I want to thank you all for coming on a Sunday, and hopefully you found this interesting. I know I did. Safe travels back to wherever you're going or locally. Thanks a lot, and thanks to the panel.